The floor creaks. But it's not her. She hasn't moved. Not for minutes. Maybe hours. She's beneath the splintered floorboards of what used to be her living room, body wrapped around her infant like a fragile shield. Dust tickles her throat. She dares not cough. Outside, Berlin is silent. But inside, thud, thud, boots, wet, heavy, coming up the hallway. A door slams somewhere down the block. Then another. Screams, not far off. Then, a laugh. Slurred. Male. Russian. She grips her child tighter. He doesn't cry. She taught him not to. The doorknob turns slowly, click, click, click. Then a boot smashes it open. She closes her eyes. One hand clutches her wedding ring, it slips from her trembling finger and falls between the boards. She doesn't reach for it. Upstairs, her neighbor is screaming. Down the hall, someone is begging. Near her, a man says in broken German, "Where's the girl?" No one answers. Another scream. Then, silence. She hears breathing. Then footsteps. They stop above her. One boot taps on the floorboard just inches above her skull. The baby stirs. She presses him close. She doesn't breathe. The soldier stands still, listening. Then, he moves on. A clock ticks. Somewhere outside, artillery thuds in the distance. But here, in this ruined home, the war is a whisper, a shadow, a nightmare with a heartbeat. And this is only the beginning. Smoke rises over rooftops in Berlin. But then, it cuts to Nanjing. Then Naples. Then a shattered village in France. Then Warsaw. Different languages. Different uniforms. Same eyes. Hungry. Hollow. Violent. A girl runs barefoot down a cobbled alley in China, chased, grabbed, dragged. Cut to a screaming woman pulled from rubble in Italy by soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. In Poland, a barn door bursts open. Inside, blood, broken glass, and silence. And in every shot, it's women. They are not soldiers. They don't hold rifles. But they are the battlefield. Because in World War II, war did not stay on the front lines. It seeped into bedrooms, cellars, fields, church basements. And in these places, something darker than bullets was unleashed. German propaganda painted Slavic women as subhuman. Japanese officers called Chinese civilians spoils. French colonial troops saw Italian women as reward. American soldiers, drunk on victory, mistook fear for affection. The war gave men guns. But it also gave them permission. Permission to take. To punish. To violate. A woman in France is shaved bald and paraded for sleeping with the enemy. Another in Berlin is raped 3 times in one night, by 3 different armies. In Sicily, soldiers smile for a photo. Behind them, a weeping girl buttons her blouse. There were no trenches here. No tanks. But make no mistake, this was a war zone. Because when power goes unchecked, and hate is stoked into fire, it's not just cities that burn. It's people. And this war burned women alive in silence. The Red Army entered Berlin like a tidal wave. Not to liberate, but to claim. To avenge. In the first days of April 1945, the city was already broken, rubble-strewn streets, windows shattered, corpses buried in the spring thaw. But the real horror hadn't begun yet. It began with the first house searched. The first door kicked in. The first woman dragged into the street. By nightfall, the city echoed with new sounds. Pleas, cries, bones breaking beneath fists and boots. In cellars, attics, churches, hospitals, no place was safe. A woman, barely 17, scribbled in her diary. I locked the door. I prayed. Then the knocking started. Another, a mother of 2, wrote days later. We've hidden in the coal room. They come anyway. My husband says nothing. He just stares at the wall. The Soviet soldiers were told it was retribution. They were told German women owed them. For Leningrad. For Stalingrad. For every brother buried in snow. Some were drunk. Others were not. It didn't matter. Between April and May, an estimated 880,000 women in Berlin were raped. The youngest known victim? Just 8 years old. The oldest? Over 80. Some were attacked once. Others, dozens of times. In a single day. Doctors reported widespread injuries. Priests heard confession after confession. Not of sin, but survival. One surgeon's report read, "There is nothing left to stitch. Only silence." It was systematic. It was ignored. And worse. It was expected. Commanders turned their eyes away. Officers claimed it was propaganda. The West stayed quiet. The Soviets called it lies. But it was real. And the women of Berlin, they didn't forget. Even when the world demanded they move on, they remembered every face, every night, every silence. And decades later, in books, in whispers, in fading pages of long-hidden diaries, they spoke. They survived. But what they endured was a war within the war. Just before dawn, the villagers of Siakia woke to a sound they thought meant freedom, Allied trucks rumbling into town. But the soldiers weren't all the same. Among them were Moroccan Gumias, colonial troops unleashed on the Italian hills. They came not just for Germans. They came for women. For grandmothers, daughters, brides. In a single night, hundreds were raped across dozens of villages. The locals would call it La Moroccanate, the Moroccan rampage. Mothers hid daughters in haylofts. Priests stood in doorways, only to be beaten aside. Some women ran into the woods, hoping darkness would hide them. It didn't. The soldiers laughed. Some carried souvenirs, rings torn from fingers, crosses ripped from necks. They left behind shattered families, bodies twisted in fields, and silence so deep it smothered every prayer. Across the Mediterranean, in Sicily, American GIs celebrated victory with wine, guns fired into the night sky, and women forced into roadside encounters. Allied newspapers hailed them as heroes. Few stories spoke of the girls who limped home at dawn. And in France, a different horror. Accused collaborators, women suspected of sleeping with German soldiers, were dragged into streets. Crowds gathered. Men, women, children watched as these women were stripped, their hair hacked off, heads shaved bloody. Some were forced to march naked through towns while neighbors spat. A priest watched and said nothing. The idea was punishment. But it was also spectacle. These weren't acts of hidden shame. They were performances. Warnings. Control. Because when victory came, it didn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brought vengeance. Sometimes, the liberators looked like monsters. And in the twisted logic of war, where sides blur and morals dissolve, the line between hero and villain was drawn in the screams of the innocent. Nanjing, 1937. The city had already surrendered. But surrender didn't matter. Not to the Japanese Imperial Army. Soldiers marched through the gates in perfect formation, disciplined, precise. And then, the order was lifted. No resistance. No rules. No mercy. Within hours, the massacre began. Men were gunned down in rows. Children thrown into rivers. And the women were hunted. In alleyways, schools, temples. Dragged into alleys, stabbed with bayonets, violated before crowds. Witnesses reported entire families forced to watch, then murdered. Pregnant women were cut open. Girls were taken from mothers, returned lifeless. Tens of thousands raped. Many mutilated. All erased in official records. But Nanjing wasn't alone. In Korea, the Imperial Army ran a machine of flesh. Comfort stations, military brothels disguised as medical posts. Tens of thousands of Korean, Chinese, and Filipino girls kidnapped or coerced. Some just 13. Lined up, tagged, rotated between regiments like equipment. Survivor testimonies tell of being forced to serve 20 to 30 soldiers a day. Some collapsed from bleeding. Others died from infections. Many were killed when deemed unfit. No names were recorded. No graves marked. They were comfort women in name. But there was no comfort. And all the while, Tokyo issued silence. Denial. Then, decades later, partial apologies, carefully worded regrets. The war in Asia was not just fought with bullets. It was fought with bodies. Used. Discarded. And the chaos wasn't from collapsing front lines. It was from collapsing humanity. Civilians fled from advancing armies, only to run straight into nightmare. And unlike Europe, where whispers of violence leaked into history, the crimes here were buried beneath shame, silence, and censorship. But even silence can't hold forever. Because the survivors remember. And in their memories, Asia's forgotten war still burns. The war ended. The flags changed. The guns went silent. But for the women, the nightmare didn't stop. It just went underground. In Berlin, survivors limped out from basements and ruins, some holding infants that weren't theirs by choice. In China, young girls stitched their clothes back together and returned to villages that no longer spoke their names. In Korea and the Philippines, comfort women were told to disappear. No medals. No tribunals. No justice. In France, the shaved women, publicly humiliated for so-called collaboration, were never offered apologies. No one asked if they had consented. No one cared if they had been forced. In post-war Italy, survivors of the Gumi's rampage were told to be grateful. After all, hadn't the Allies saved them? And so, the world moved on, without them. Courtrooms filled with generals, ministers, commanders, men in medals and suits. War crimes trials made headlines. But rape was not on the docket. It wasn't even classified as a war crime. The Hague focused on borders, not broken bodies. One prosecutor said quietly, off record, "Sexual violence is difficult to prove. Best not to dwell on it." Some women tried. One German woman filed a complaint against a Soviet officer. She was laughed out of court. A Chinese survivor from Nanjing testified in Tokyo. She was told the documents were missing. Most simply stayed silent. Because those who spoke were blamed. Branded as ruined. Tainted. Some burned their diaries. Others buried them behind bricks or under floorboards. And those children, born of war and violation, grew up in shadows. Mixed-race infants abandoned. Mothers exiled from their own towns. Even in peace, the war followed them. In whispers. In stares. In shame. And through it all, one fact remained. No one came to help them. Decades passed. But memories don't age. They settle. They ache. They wait. In the 1950s, a woman in Berlin published a diary under a false name, A Woman in Berlin. Her account was raw. Unfiltered. Too honest. Germany shunned her. The book was buried. In Korea, survivors of the Japanese comfort stations remained silent for 50 years. It wasn't until the 1990s that a few elderly women stepped forward. They faced cameras, reporters, politicians, and told the world what was done to them. Hands trembling. Voices steady. They spoke not for pity, but for truth. These women were not footnotes. Not casualties. Not ghosts. They were witnesses. And their stories dismantled the myth of clean war, of noble armies, of honorable victory. They reminded us that war is not just waged with bombs and rifles, but with power and silence and the permission to look away. They bore scars that tribunals ignored. They carried pain that history books refused to print. But they endured. And because they endured, we know that Berlin was not just a battle. That Nanjing was not just a massacre. That liberation did not mean safety. And that survival sometimes meant silence. Today, some of their stories are taught. A few memorials stand. But the world still struggles to listen. And so, let this not be just a story. Let it be a reckoning. Because if we only remember the battles, the flags, and the victories, we forget the cost. The real cost. So ask yourself, would you have believed them? Would you have spoken up? Would you have cared? If it wasn't your sister? Your mother? Your child? Some say this is just history. But history lives on. In silence, in shame, in the unmarked graves of forgotten women. If this story moved you, let someone else hear it too. Share it. Talk about it. Don't let them be erased again. Because silence was the first weapon. And memory is the last defense.